Therapy Came Alive. We're going to be discussing media bias and a whole lot more. With me today is Professor Robert Jensen. His recent book, Plain Radical: Living, Loving, and Learning to Leave the Planet Gracefully. It's a fabulous book. I highly recommend it to everyone. And who is Robert Jensen? Well, let me tell you. Robert William Jensen spent his 20s working at newspapers as a reporter and copy editor, receiving an MA in journalism and public affairs from American University. After earning a PhD in media ethics and law from the University of Minnesota in '92, he began his teaching career at the University of Texas at Austin, where he is a professor in journalism and interdisciplinary programs. Jensen is also active in a variety of national political movements and community organizations. Let's welcome to the show, Dr. Jensen. Welcome, sir.
Well, thank you, Carlos. Great to be with you.
So this is interesting because I know we discussed earlier via email, really, about media bias. But first thing I wanted to see is, what did you find out and how did you get involved in studying this?
Well, as a journalist, I was always somewhat unthinking in the practice of journalism. That's often the case, that people who work in a field don't get a chance to step back and reflect on it or critique the field. And once I started graduate school and had some more time and space to think about what journalism does, I started to think more about how the media is biased, not in the way that we typically hear people talking about it. Is the media too liberal? Is it too conservative? But how to talk about deeper biases built into journalism and its relationship to systems and structures of power. So I think there is an important question about media bias. It's just not the one that you tend to hear asked in the mainstream.
Fascinating. Well, now we're going to have to explore. So what are some of these deeper biases?
Well, let's take the fundamental charge of journalism. Journalists make a claim to society, buy our newspapers, listen to our shows, because we'll help you be a citizen. That is, journalism's claim to special status in society is based on the role that journalism plays in informing and activating citizens to participate in self-governance. Everybody understands that citizens need an independent source of information and analyses if they're to meaningfully participate. That is to say, if all your information comes from the government, then you can't really be a fully functioning citizen. If all of your information comes from corporations, you can't really function as a citizen. So we need an independent source of information and analysis, and that's the role of journalism. But of course, journalists don't live in a bubble. They're affected by the distribution of wealth and power in society. So the first and most obvious thing is most journalism is done in a for-profit corporate setting. And corporations have an interest. Their interest is not only in making money, of course. That's the only thing really a corporation in the short term is interested in. But the corporate sector also is interested in perpetuating a system that allows the corporate sector to exist. That is, they tend to be strongly in favor of the existing economic system, capitalism. Well, can journalists be critical of the underlying foundation of our economy, that capitalist system, if they're working for people whose interests are in perpetuating that system? That's a fundamental question. Can journalists truly be independent when reporting on the economy? Can journalists step back and not only write stories about this CEO or that particular economic policy, but really write about the system itself? And that's, I think, one of the biases we see, that journalists are biased in favor of the existing economic system. To put it more bluntly, they're biased in favor of capitalism. That's the nature of the world in which they work. And I think that bias tends to be forgotten because we live in a world so defined across the board by the existing economic system. But those are the kinds of questions we need to ask.
Those are great questions to ask. Let me ask you this. What's your opinion on this? I know some people argue that maybe the news is better the way it was 40, 50 years ago when it was more about public radio, public television. They weren't really run by corporations. And I'm not completely accurate on this. You might have to correct me if I'm wrong. Compared to the news today, where it is, I think they say most of the news stations, 95% are owned by only 6 or 7 corporations. What's your take on that?
Well, the United States historically has had a very diverse media system. If you go back to the founding of the country, the early years of the Republic, most of the media was publicly subsidized. And by that I mean, of course, we're talking about newspapers well before electronic journalism. And the U.S. government subsidized journalism by giving newspapers and magazines reduced postage rates, sometimes even free postage.
Oh,
And
wow.
that was a big subsidy back then. A lot of the newspapers in the early years of the Republic were funded by political parties. That is, newspapers had a political identity. There was the Jeffersonian paper, and there was the Federalist paper. And so if you go back in U.S. history, you find a very different media system. It was in the 19th century and then, of course, intensified in the 20th century that most of our journalism became corporate and commercial, that it was owned often by very large corporations. We're talking about here people like William Randolph Hearst, Joseph Pulitzer, the early media barons who owned large numbers of properties. And they were looking to make money. And we've had a traditionally corporate, for-profit dominated media system ever since. Now, there have been periods where public radio and public television did emerge, although they've never been a strong component of it. In general, I tend to be skeptical that there was ever a golden age. There are some ways in which journalism today is much better, more sophisticated than it was, let's say, when I was born in 1958. There are some ways in which it's less engaged, though, with the mood of the public. It's less public service oriented. It's more entertainment dominated. There are ways in which journalism, I think, is impoverished today. So you can see, as is often the case, ways we've made progress and ways we've fallen behind. But in general, I think the role of mainstream journalism, and here I mean the corporate commercial sector, the daily newspapers people read, the cable and broadcast news channels that people watch, and the internet sites that tend to be related to those other media. So people talk a lot about the internet as changing journalism, and certainly it has. But the most heavily trafficked internet sites for news tend to be connected to what we call legacy media, meaning those media that have a legacy in the old era, the New York Times, CNN.
Huh.
So there are ways that the news business has changed dramatically, and there are ways it's pretty much the same as it's been for the last, 50, 60 years.
That's a good answer. Let me ask you your opinion on this. Do you think channels like a Fox News or MSNBC, ones that are blatantly one-sided or another, do you think they're damaging the credibility?
Well, Fox News is interesting because in some sense nobody really thinks of Fox News as news in the sense of independent. It's well known. It's, rooted in a particular political party, a particular philosophy. Now, they do journalism at Fox News. I mean, we tend to think about Fox News as embodied in its most well-known hosts like Bill O'Reilly. But there is journalism that's done at Fox. Fox is a mix of both entertainment and political propaganda and real news. All right? MSNBC tried that model on the Democratic Party side of the fence. It didn't really work well for MSNBC, and they've moved back to a more ideologically neutered kind of position. But, is Fox News really news? Well, I think if you look at CNN, you could ask the same question. A lot of what's on CNN is not terribly helpful if you're a citizen trying to understand the world. In other words, I think there are reasons to critique Fox News, no matter what one's politics are, because I think they have politicized news in a certain way that isn't healthy. But on the other hand, a lot of television news, especially cable television news, I don't think is particularly useful, whatever its ideology. And so it's easy to always point to examples like Fox that so clearly have, in ways I think it's honest to say, a kind of negative effect on the political discourse and the state of journalism. But they're not the only problem, and in my point of view, they're not the biggest problem.
Interesting. Well, Fox will be happy about that. Let me ask you this.
Oh, no, I don't watch. Let me make it clear. I don't watch Fox. I think most of what's on Fox is some version of either outright lying or heavily distorted. And when it isn't a lie or distorted, it's usually not very interesting. But so I don't want to endorse Fox News. Let's be clear here. But
No.
The main problem of American news media today, I don't think is really Fox News. I think it's a larger crisis of a deeper critique that we typically would want from journalism that contemporary journalism simply has a hard time providing.
Let me ask you this, just to make sure we have clarity here. Is it the more subtle ones then? It seemed like you insinuated CNN doesn't provide, I'll let you say it, but it wasn't providing what we needed in regards to understanding the world better. Is it because they're subtly just presenting news that supports ratings?
Yeah, and first of all, television, I think, should be critiqued for the way it is trivial, superficial, image-driven, all the things that people complain about. Well, people complain about those things because they're an accurate critique. So there's some serious problems with television, especially commercial television. But beyond that, the question is any journalistic outlet in the mainstream really providing the critical apparatus we need as citizens to understand the world? Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. That invasion was illegal. Now, by that I mean under international law, treaties that the United States has signed, the invasion of Iraq was what in the law they call a crime against peace. I also think it's undoubtedly true that there were war crimes committed by the U.S. military in the invasion of Iraq. Okay. Now, that's a position I hold, but it's a position held by many people around the world, both legal scholars and political analysts and ordinary people. Now, how many American news media outlets did serious reporting on whether or not the United States was guilty of crimes, of violations of international law? Well, if you look across the board, that question was never asked on Fox News. It also was never asked on CNN. It was also never asked in the New York Times. That on fundamental questions that really call into question and challenge American power, we rarely see American news media providing that deep critique in the same way that I suggested the American business press rarely provides the deep critique of the economic system. And so one of the fundamental questions of any system of journalism is, can it really challenge power? And in the case of the contemporary U.S. mainstream media, and again, I want to point out I'm talking about the corporate commercial media, the New York Times, the local daily newspaper, the broadcast and cable news networks that provide the great majority of the information that most people in the U.S. get. Are those media outlets ever really providing that deeper critique? And that's the question I think we should be asking. And from my examination, both as someone who's worked in journalism and someone who's studied journalism, I think the answer is no. I don't think our news media does provide that critique. And that's why I say the most important bias in the news media is, in a sense, a bias in favor of the status quo, in favor of the existing distribution of wealth and power. Now, I'm not saying there's never any critique. For instance, you'll get reporting in the U.S. news media on how the economic inequality in America has intensified over the last 3-4 decades. You will find reporting about that, but it usually stops at asking any critical question about, for instance, is inequality inherent in capitalism, and is it morally unacceptable, and what are we going to do about it? Those kind of questions almost never get asked, and that's what I think increasingly the American public wants. I think that's a lot of the reason that people who otherwise aren't interested in political campaigns are gravitating toward a campaign like Bernie Sanders, because they see that the people in power aren't asking those questions. I don't think Bernie Sanders asks them deeply enough either, but at least he's putting it on the table.
That's a fabulous point. Fabulous point. What do you think about PBS NewsHour, their format where they have two individuals? I think I've seen them sometimes discuss heavy issues such as income inequality and others, and they usually put 2 points of view. Is that something you think would be the most fair?
Well, yeah, certainly a diversity of viewpoints is necessary in a democracy. The question is on those shows, whether it's PBS or CNN or whatever, these kind of counterpoint shows, the question is what points of view are allowed to debate. You know, the one I listen to regularly is on NPR's All Things Considered, where David Brooks and E.J. Dionne. Right? Okay, well, those are a moderate Democrat and a pretty conservative Republican, although in modern terms he's kind of moderate because the Republican Party has moved so far to the right.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? There are lots of political opinions far to the left of E.J. Dionne. And this is a common thing that mainstream news media do. they'll put on somebody from the right wing and then somebody from essentially the center and consider that to be covering all viewpoints. And that raises an important question, is what's the political spectrum in the United States today? And is it represented in mainstream media? Well, the right wing is represented. I mean, you don't have to go very far to see really quite reactionary right wing, sometimes even almost kind of fascist right wing views that get aired in the mainstream media. Those kind of people are guests on not only the Fox News shows, but also on CNN and related kinds of mainstream channels. But voices that are that far to the left, in other words, the voices that will raise questions about whether the U.S. invasion of Iraq was lawful, about whether U.S. officials should be prosecuted for war crimes, about whether fundamental fairness is possible within capitalism, and then moving on to even more important questions in some sense about the health of the planet, the ecological questions, which are almost never seriously debated on mainstream media. Well, then the question is, whose voices are being left out? And typically it's the most critical voices that really don't show up in mainstream media. So, yes, point-counterpoint shows are useful. Often they're very engaging. But the question is, who's allowed into that debate? Who are the two people who are allowed to have a voice? And often it's a fairly right-leaning political spectrum that is represented there.
That's a fabulous point. I never thought about it that way before. There's so much to look for.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it's a complex world, and it ain't easy. I'm 57 years old, and I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time. And every day I feel challenged by the questions that we have to deal with, fundamental questions about the shape of the economy, about the distribution of power in the world. Much of this a result of the consequences of the abuse of power in the U.S., I think. And then on top of that is this really overarching question about the health of the ecosystems that our own lives are dependent on. When you start really engaging these things, it's a challenge. And I think that the contemporary mainstream news media too often is not up to the challenge. And that's what I would like to see more of. More of this more critical engagement with questions that aren't a lot of fun in some sense. I mean, I don't like thinking about the current health of the planet, but if we don't start thinking about it, the consequences are going to be incredibly grim.
Absolutely. We have about 2 minutes left, and I want to get in here really quickly your book, as well as any news outlets, or whether it be newspapers, magazines, websites that you recommend for us.
Well, on the second point, I read the New York Times every day, even though often I'm critical of some of the things in it. I try to read a diversity of publications. I'm not a big fan of the electronic media. I do listen to radio. I think long-form radio is often very helpful. But at this point, you can't be informed as a citizen by reading only one or two sites or one or two publications. You really have to get outside of that. And a lot of this is directly related to the book, Plain Radical, because the book is a very personal story about my relationship with a friend and mentor who helped me kind of understand the world in this way. But it's also an attempt to, in plain language, identify what are these crucial issues, what are these systems and structures of power that we need to think about, and what's a critical way to think about them. In fact, a very radical way to think about them, but in plain language. My friend, Jim Coplin, about whom the book is written, was a very radical thinker, but he always communicated in very plain ways, and that's what the book tries to do.
Sounds like a fascinating book. I highly recommend it for everybody to read. Plain Radical, Living, Loving, and Learning to Leave the Planet Gracefully. Dr. Jensen, thank you so much for being here.
Well, it's a great conversation. Thanks so much for having me.
It was a wonderful conversation. We were only about, 18 minutes. I wanted to go on for another hour. Unfortunately, we don't have that time.
We can always do another segment someday in the future if you like.
Absolutely. And where can we get more information about you? Where do we go?
My website is online. If you put my name into a search engine, it'll be the first site that pops up, Robert Jensen, and there's an archive of articles I've written as well as information about my books.
And is it Robert Jensen or Robert W. Jensen for your website?
It's robertwjensen.org, but if you
Okay.
put Robert Jensen into Google, it's the first thing that pops up.
Oh, there you go. Thank you again, Dr. Jensen. We truly appreciate it.
Great, thank you.
Everyone, Robert Jensen, look for him, robertwjensen.org. Wonderful insight into the media. I'm telling you, it's a big problem. You really want to learn the truth of what's going on out there, and you want to avoid these deceptions and biases that the media, unfortunately, is subjected to.